Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This journey is with brother Rashad Amra. I'm happy to have my friend and brother Rashad in the studio. He's an economist, he's a public servant, works at the South African Parliamentary Budget Office. And I'm happy to have an economist, especially a young Muslim, inshallah, bright economist with me, because I have some tough questions about Islam and economics and finance. أهلا وسهلا أخي.
شكرا والسلام.
أهلا عليكم السلام. جزاك الله خير. I'm hearing recently that several people who started Islamic banks in Dubai and in Saudi Arabia and so on are denouncing the idea and announcing that they regretted what they did, giving up on Islamic banking altogether. That's very interesting. What do you think of that? Is Islamic banking something that failed? Why are they doing that?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I'm not exactly sure of the particulars of the arguments, but I think one needs to ask the question: what do we mean by Islamic banking? What do we mean by when we use this epithet Islamic? When is something truly Islamic? Is it essentially a cog in a system, a broader capitalist system that isn't realizing what we would term the maqasid of Islamic economics? So let's go back and try and define what do we mean as the maqasid of Islamic economics. Is it purely to consume something where there's no exploitation taking place or any haram taking place, so to speak? Or is it a bit broader when we define something, when you use the term, the very weighty term Islamic? Okay. In my view, having looked at a limited degree at the evolution of Islamic finance as a sub-component of Islamic economics, because economics is a lot broader than just finance. I think the fact that it exists quite comfortably in a system, a global economic system that doesn't engender justice, that doesn't engender social justice, that doesn't engender development for everybody, but rather for the few elites and the rest of the world's population serve global capital, then one needs to ask the question, what is the role of Islamic finance, or what is the role of Islamic economics? Perhaps the evolution is a bit of a Frankenstein. It was created with a good intention, but now it's taken over the very purpose. So I think these are critical reflections required from those involved in Islamic economics and Islamic finance.
Critical reflections. One of them is saying that there isn't something that's called Islamic banks, because a bank is non-Islamic by definition. What do you think of that from your background in economics? Could we have in Islam something that's called a bank, or is it necessarily an unfair and injustice institution?
Mm-hmm. So if you go back to conventional economic theory, a bank is essentially provides the function of agency. So certain people have excess resources, certain people are shy of resources or short of resources, and there's excess, and excess can meet the demands of those that don't have. And this works better if it's person on person, but the modern economy requires some sort of agency, and that's where banks come in. The challenge comes in terms of how do we deal with the power imbalance between those that have and those that don't have. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons for at least in our understanding, Allah knows best, one of the reasons that riba or interest usury is forbidden is because there's a imbalance in terms of the relationship between the lender and the borrower. Mm-hmm. Now, in an interest-based system, the person borrowing is always at a disadvantage, particularly when you consider compound interest, when you consider interest that's well in excess of the rate of inflation, so that's essentially real interest. This takes place. Now, the very function of meeting the needs of those that are borrowers and meeting the needs of those that are lenders is in and of itself not a problem. The terms for me are the problem. Okay. When we take the different types of products that so-called Islamic banks offer, and we compare the rates to conventional riba-bearing loans, often there's not much of a difference, and sometimes the differences are skewed in the favor of riba-based banks. One may make the argument that's because they haven't reached critical mass in terms of having volumes of customers, and there is some justification to that. But how is this really changing the system? How is this?
That was a very important question that critics ask. They say, well, if it is the same mortgage contract, but instead of the word interest or mortgage, there is the word rent. Mm-hmm. how Islamic is this? Like, is this, just to halalize the mortgage without really changing anything about the content. In fact, the bank, in this case, the Islamic bank, would make more money than the conventional bank. So how Islamic is this? What do you think of this kind of twisting of the capitalist dealings in order to make them Islamic?
I think when we use the term Islamic, again, it's a very weighty term, because the moment scholars use the term Islamic and non-experts, it's to say, and it's to actually play off people's taqwa, because you want to do something that's in accordance with the Quran and the Sunnah, and so you call something Islamic. Now, in my view, it's a very weighty term. To call something Islamic is to say that, hey, this stands for what Islam stands for. It stands for Tawheed. It stands for Qist, meaning justice. It stands for the oneness of God. It stands for engendering a society that's based on the Quranic and the prophetic example, ﷺ, right? If it doesn't do that, then maybe we should re-question whether it's Islamic. One could say it's a lesser of two evils. I think, that's slightly more solid ground to stand on and saying this is not as bad as going into a usurious contract where interest is compounded, where the poor are exploited, where there are clear terms. Because one of the advantages of for instance, the Mudaraba contract offered by some of the Islamic banks or Islamic subsidiaries of conventional banks, some of the terms are a bit clearer, some of the terms are a bit more favorable towards the borrower. So I think it's on that continuum of where we need to be going. This is not to say that it adds little value. I think the journey needs to continue. We can't say, hey, we've got Mudaraba and we've got Musharaka, let's go and buy fancy German sedans. No, the Islamic imperative or the imperative of an Islamic economy is about meeting the needs of all of society, not about accumulation.
How can we get there? How can we draw this utopia of Islamic economics? Is there a picture that is drawn somewhere from your?
In my view, a lot of most of the thinking and most of the application, most of the ijtihad by specialists has been around the very narrow world of Islamic finance. I think the conversation needs to be broadened to discuss an Islamic economy. Now, this shouldn't just be framed in the context of an Islamic state, but a society that is Islamic. So a society can be Islamic both in a Western secular democracy like South Africa, or a society can be Islamic in a slightly more Muslim majority country like Indonesia or Malaysia. So I think we need to broaden the discussion away from just finance, to speak about distribution patterns, to speak about consumption, to speak about conspicuous consumption, to speak about the rights of the neighbors and the rights of the poor, which we as Muslims are supposed to be first and foremost in terms of fulfilling. I think at the same time one needs to be pragmatic, because we do live in a profit-driven, profit-based society. So a business can't eat into their profit to the point where there's zero real profit and this business is not sustainable. One tweak at the margin, if you like, has been the role of social business. It has made some modest strides in different parts of the world, including this country. A lot needs to be done. It's not an easy system to deal with, but we have to talk.
But some people say that in order for the economics to serve social justice, you have to go to the left. You have to allow the control of the state on margins of profit and this kind. So is the Islamic economics necessarily leftist economics? Is it closer to the communist model than the capitalist model? Some people argue the exact opposite. What do you think? Some people say, no, it's closest to the capitalist model rather than... so what do you think?
Okay. I think Islam, as in economics, as in politics, doesn't prescribe a defined system. It prescribes particular outcomes. Right?
Like
we want social justice. We want justice. We don't want inequality or intolerable levels of inequality. We want people to be sharing with their neighbors, their brothers and sisters, with society. Nobody should go hungry. If you look at the spirit of Umar bin Khattab, the idea of his nightly patrols. If you look at the idea of none of you is a believer, the hadith, none of you is a believer if his neighbor goes to bed hungry. right? And the Zahiris considered neighbors 40 in other directions. The point being, we can't live in communities where people are going hungry without basic needs being met. Basic needs in the modern age is beyond just hunger and shelter, beyond food and shelter. It includes education, it includes social security, it includes healthcare. Now, those are outcomes that in the Islamic economy, and here I'm speaking quite normatively, demands. This is what we require as society. Obviously, resources constrain your ability to realize those outcomes. But unless your system engenders that, then the system is problematic if it's not doing that. How we achieve that is the crux of the conversation. And that, for me, depends on modern systems. It depends on what works well. The past 30 to 40 years have shown, in my view, that trickle-down economics, where profit maximization and hoping that people invest in social capital and invest in human capital, and all of a sudden they'll climb up the ladder and then allow their children to have better futures, has proven that it hasn't worked. Recent studies have shown that there's been more accumulation in most societies in the world that accrued to the top 1%, the top 5%, the top 10%. Even in the capitalist society par excellence, United States of America, inequality has grown over the past 4 decades, which suggests that a laissez-faire approach where the state takes a backseat and let the market distribute resources is not working. So in my view, more state intervention is required. From the state and obviously civil society. I think those can complement each other.
How do we do with the state being a democracy, let's say in South Africa or other democratic countries, and that democracy is highly influenced by the top 1% in terms of media, in terms of funding campaigns, like in the reality of things. The top 1% shape the economy and shape the politics. How do we break out of this?
I think this is the question of our times for many social movements, many people who want a better world. I think South Africa is a bit better off because we have a tradition of a critical left that's always been agitating towards greater redistribution. If I may speak about our country, the change in poverty, pre-distribution and post-distribution through social grants and through access to publicly provided healthcare and education shows significant reduction in both inequality as well as poverty rates. Now, the point over here is we inherited a strong critical tradition where the social contract that espouses social justice is strong. At the same time, as you mentioned, there are tendencies or forces that try and move against this from the establishment, from established capital, from big business. I think it's the responsibility of social movements to agitate towards greater redistribution, higher levels of corporate taxation that's used for the purposes of redistribution and meeting basic needs, as opposed to the entrenched elites and establishment.
But social movements sometimes are not allowed to function, like we have back in Canada and the United States and in Europe. We had this Occupy Wall Street movement, and some of the youth tried to rectify some of the problems of the capitalist system, and they were crushed simply by the media and by the security forces sometimes. So how can the social movement really make a difference and change the status quo that is controlled by the top 1%?
I don't think I have an obvious answer to that question. In fact, I think there's a lot of a very disillusioned left across the world. When leftist parties have taken power over the past 1.5 decades, most recently in Greece, in Brazil, in Venezuela, the outcomes have not been sustainable. So I think many people across the world are trying to answer this question: how do we advocate for a stronger social conscience and social justice that comes out through the state?
Perhaps through Islam, perhaps through a new Islamic thought in economics, perhaps then we can have a new thought that changes the status quo. Do you think Islam could contribute to this equation?
I think working together with other people of different backgrounds and faiths who want the same objectives as Islam, I strongly believe so. In fact, our very belief system is that truth will prevail and a better future lies in if we follow the Quran, if we follow the Sunnah. But we need to take this away from platitudes. following the Quran and the Sunnah, and the Sunnah speaking about Islam is the answer, I think it requires some critical thought on what are the imperatives. And the imperatives need to come down to our basic choices, our basic consumption choices, our basic redistribution choices. We shouldn't just have an external locus of focus. It should also be internal. It's not just about the South African state or the Norwegian state or the Canadian state in terms of their redistribution policies. It is what our community is doing within themselves. How are we distributing our zakah? What are we funding? Are we funding large masajid and expensive Umrah and Hajj visits at 7-star hotels? Or are we saying, there's a modest amount that's required and excess should be towards that which generates the greatest social good?
Social justice. Yeah, well, unfortunately, the Islamic movements in general, being a bit critical here, were more to the right and more of the example, as you mentioned, of the funding of expensive Umrah trips and expensive, Islamic tourism and Islamic, halal food, etc., rather than putting the funds and the effort and the campaigning in social justice issues, as if these social justice issues by definition are leftist parties kind of issues, not Islamic issues. So I think the Islamic movements and the Islamic social groups and so on should move to the left a little bit. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I strongly believe that what is absent from our expression of Islam, and I think it's certainly the case in South Africa, is social justice in terms of our engagement on the economy and engagement in politics. South Africa is going through local elections pretty soon. A lot of the discussion is around, which party to vote for. This particular party takes a stronger stance on the cause of the Palestinians, for social justice for the Palestinians and statehood. The other party supposedly doesn't. In my view, this is not an Islamic issue the way we're expressing it. In my view, I think South Africans are very fervent when it comes to Palestine, not because of their Islam, but primarily because of sentiment and emotion. Because if it was about our Islam, it would be about social justice and the rights of fellow Muslims and fellow human beings. And if this were the case, we would be consistent. We would make a noise about the Saudi occupation and bombing of Yemen. We would be up in arms about what's going on in southern Sudan. We would be up in arms about the fact that millions of South Africans aren't able to meet basic needs. Now, if the expression of our Islam was based, of our political and economic expression was because of our Islam, we would take consistent positions across all issues, not just make a lot of justified noise about Palestine to the South African government, but we would do the same thing about poverty. We'll be doing things about all struggles for humanity, not just emotion and sentiment. And whilst the cause of the Palestinians is a legitimate one that we must support, there are also other struggles that we must support with the equal level of fervor and conviction, because it's based on the same objectives of social justice for all of humanity.
Of course, the Palestinian issue is a major Islamic issue, but it's also an Islamic issue to feed the hungry and give shelter to the shelterless and rescue the poor and so forth. These are Islamic issues that are mentioned clearly in the Quran. وَطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ, to feed the hungry, etc. This is Islamic too. Unfortunately, the Islamic agenda oftentimes is more of a political agenda, on the global politics kind of agenda, and is less concerned about the social issues that are very much at the heart of the Islamic concern, the human being, the human condition. Now, the Islamic economics is defined by many people as a zero interest system. Is it possible to have a zero interest system? I'm not an expert in economics, so I'm asking you this kind of question. Is it possible in today's world to say we're going to create a system in a particular country or even a province or a city that is zero interest? Is it possible?
Okay. You mentioned that the Islamic economy is viewed as a zero interest system. So yeah, I think finance is one component of economics. So let's just talk about finance within as a component of economics. Is it possible to have a zero interest? I think to ignore the fact that we're living in a world where we have what's fiat money. So the point is, money itself, currency, doesn't have any intrinsic value, right? So in the past we had something known as the gold standard, where 20 rands or $20 was based on some, it was backed by some underlying value. It was worth X amount of gold or silver, whatever it is. And when it was based with that, is you didn't have such hyperinflation, because when the money stock was increased, it was because there was more gold or platinum or silver in reserve. In today's time, money can just be created, money is just printed. The US Federal Reserve decides to inject more money into the system, the value of the money then falls. So with such high, such sporadic, such unpredictable inflation, which is essentially, in the words of Milton Friedman, a monetary phenomenon everywhere you go, it becomes very challenging. And I think significant thought is required in that respect. I don't have an answer. I'm not convinced that this is where our initial focus should be. I think that's more for longer term objective, trying to eliminate this. I think yes, riba is obviously exploitation, but there's a continuum of exploitation that it facilitates. And in my view, we need to be quite pragmatic given the world we live in. So you say, or hypothetically somebody says, we need to move away from a riba-based system, we try some sort of substitute which tastes the same as riba, which is riba with a different name, although there's some merits to it. It hasn't changed much for us.
But then the zero interest argument itself, do you think that economically speaking it's fair to give the money back at zero interest? Like if I put my money in the bank and then after a year the bank gives me my $100 back, even though there's inflation and there are other things and the bank used the money. How can we resolve this? Because I argue sometimes that in the interest rate, partly there is inflation, partly there are other economic factors, and this is not only riba that is there. What do you think? What do you think of that?
Absolutely. I think as you mentioned, I think inflation plays a significant erodes the value of your money. So one could argue, and this is just an argument, that if there are zero real interest rates, so for instance if the interest rate is the same as the rate of inflation, then if you put your money in an interest-bearing account and all you get back is the real value plus no return over some time, is that really interest? I think that's a very complicated question to try and answer because there's many factors affecting that. At the same time, the whole idea of finance in Islam is that you have to bear some type of risk. Now, if you had gold and you kept it under your bed instead of in a deposit somewhere else, there's still risk associated with it. Not just risk in terms of the value being eroded, but holding risk and other forms of risk. At the same time, you're not really getting a return because that asset is lying unproductive. So I think these are some of the components that need to consider. I think it's a very challenging question. Some more formidable experienced minds have tried to answer this with some different views on whether a zero real interest rate is actually riba. I don't have a strong view right now.
Yeah, but are you aware of research on this? Because what you are saying right now is that there is more research required to the issue of just out flat saying that every interest is riba. There has to be some more research in this in order to see what is the interest that is considered riba and what is not. And do you think that this is a fair question? I think
we need to define riba, right? I think that's where difference of opinion emerges based on the definition. I think where it's certainly not up for debate is if you look at microfinance. And South Africa is a classic case of microfinance where poor individuals with limited earning power go to what we call loan sharks and get charged 20-30% interest, and that's sheer exploitation. That is the worst possible form. And on the other extreme is when banks borrow from banks, known as the repurchase rate or the interbank rate. Is the exploitation of banks going on in there? I'm not sure. Is that borrowing money? It is borrowing money. Is there an underlying commodity? No, there's no underlying commodity. And so I think between those two extremes, we need to clarify our definitions. I think for that, we need people who really understand monetary economics, who really understand finance, and who also have a good understanding of both the usul, allowing us to come to the conclusion that riba is haram, at the same time understanding the maqasid of modern economy based on the Quran, based on the Sunnah, based on the work that's come beforehand. And obviously this is a very weighty subject because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares war in this respect. So it's something that needs to be taken seriously, and a lot more work needs to go into this.
Jazakallah khair. Well, at least in this conversation we brought some questions for those who might be interested to answer these questions from a research perspective. But I'm hoping that at least we demonstrated that there are so many open questions and things are not as black and white in terms of the Islamic finances and Islamic economics as many people wish to present. For that I thank you very much, Akhi, Jazakallah khair, and Allah bless you. And this is the end of this journey with Islamic economics, Islamic finances, and questions about them. And see you next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.